But there is this deeper issue of the constant suggestion, the irrelevant suggestion of fascism. Peter Boyer wrote recently in the Hobart Mercury, "The question of population and whether we should try to limit global or national populations is about as vexed as you can get. Whenever it's raised publicly, accusations of misanthropy or eugenics or good old-fashioned fascism are never far behind. There are many people, including some so-called Green leaders, to whom that seems perfectly reasonable. But excuse me, fascism? Wasn't the fascist leader Mussolini a passionate advocate of population growth, notorious for his ranting lectures on how he wanted 20 milioni Italiani in army, 20 million Italian men in the army, and the duty of women was, of course, to breed them. Similar views, of course, were held by his Nazi ally, Hitler. And, of course, right through World War II, fascism was a precise term. It meant the ideology of the Italian government as opposed to the German government. Yet, as George Orwell pointed out in his famous 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, within 1 year of the end of World War II, the word fascism, in Orwell's words, had now no meaning except insofar as it signifies something not desirable. I think we have to be quite severe on people who use these kinds of arguments because many of them are moral bullies. It may not have escaped your attention that the three great throwers of the racist slur in Australian politics have recently been convicted of serious crimes, crimes that go directly to the heart of their credibility. It's true, of course, that any organisation with more than 100 members will have a few odd ones in it. Minor forms of mental illness are fairly common. Any large organisation will have 1 or 2 embarrassing members. But when you're out of 3, you start to see that what's happening is that moral bullies are often, in fact, people who are rather immoral themselves. They need to keep striking this attitude of moral superiority, and it gives them that enormous sense of entitlement. Why should they pay a mere speeding fine? Sheila Newman wrote a rather passionate account in these terms. She wrote, "Federal and state governments, led mainly by Victorian governments since Kennett, began renewed population increase policies relatively covertly in the latter part of the second half of the 20th century. The Murdoch media was, of course, much more open in its urging of population growth. When various academics or politically aware people, such as we've heard from today, noticed and objected to this unrepresentative stealth, the objectors were very quickly frightened into silence by accusations of racism. These accusations of racism, says Sheila, have been pretty unfounded. It is an old trick of governments to divide and conquer, and this is what has been happening." She points out that Australian ruling classes derive much of their income from buying and selling land and its product. For this they demand a constantly expanding number of citizen consumers. And of course, all governments are on the take. They all take very large donations from developers, from the sellers of white goods, and from big businesses. And as you know, it is fraud for a company to make political donations. Of course it is. It's fraud for the directors of a company to take money away because of their political sympathy, unless they are getting a benefit for their shareholders. So let's assume that these big companies, which usually donate to both sides of politics, in fact, are not fraudulent political enthusiasts. They are getting a benefit. In other words, they are getting favourable decisions they could not have got by making reasonable representations to government. These donations are, in effect, bribes, and they hold in place this plutocracy. How would you describe our system of government? Partly a democracy, and it's partly a plutocracy ruled by the rich. A plutocracy with democratic trimmings, or a democracy sliding into plutocracy. But the big donations underpin it. And what saves the politicians from actually being charged by the National Crimes Authority is that they don't take the money personally into their hands. They take it into their party, they get political successes from it, they manage to win elections from it, and the whole party is, of course, fairly well awash with money, and they all tend to do rather well out of it. But you can't actually say they took a bribe for a specific decision, even though it's very obvious. Some developers will tell you that a donation of up to $500 just means you'd like to be well regarded by the government. Over $500 usually means you want something specific for it. Kevin Rudd does actually have legislation on the which he's actually tried to put through to greatly reduce the scope of these donations. I think this is a very important cause we need to be aware of and supporting. On that whole issue, I think understand that it is a moralised debate. Understand the meta-debate. Don't just debate. Many scientists, many academic researchers are very good at explaining their own specialty. But when someone says, isn't that fascist or isn't that racist, they shrivel up and they don't know how to debate. You have to understand this is a kind of king of the castle game where the other party, who often has very strong vested interests, wants to appear morally superior. You have to be quite an aggressive debater often. You will find that, like most bullies, they're cowards. When you turn it back on them, start talking about their vested interests, when they start to talk about the murky agenda that lies behind some green politics, just start talking about the murky agenda that lies behind some growthist politics, and you'll find they very soon tire of that debate. Which brings me to what this book was about. There's nothing in this book that hasn't been endlessly discussed on the Population Forum that isn't known to Jennifer Goldie, to John Coulter, to any of us who've been in this society for some time. But there's a strange power in putting it all together in one book. It's very effective in debate. And what I've found is I bought 1,000 copies of this book just to keep it in print after the publisher sold out, thinking it would last some years. They've sold in 2.5 months. They've sold in particular because people are buying multiple copies and they're using them to convert others, which was the intention of the book. People, one councillor bought one, read it, bought 17 more, one for each of his fellow councillors. We have a vet in Whyalla who may be here today who's bought 50. People are... He's not? He's filming. Hi. Incidentally, I have another vet friend in Sydney who tells me that in Western Sydney the average life of a cat is 3 years before it gets run over. Now there's an interesting example of quality of life declining with urban crowding. So the advantage of a book like this is it's all in one place. You go in to see your MP, you show him the chapter on the cost of population in Australia, and he says, yes, but what about other nations? You say, look at chapter 2. Or he says, what about our ageing population? You say, that's refuted in chapter 4, and so on. To have it all in one place and the refutations of the obvious cop-outs, distortions and excuses for not thinking about population makes a difference. So a typical email I've had from one reader who may actually be here said, I'm so grateful to have found a book that gives me the facts to explain my gut feeling that the drive for economic growth is irrational and dangerous. I guess I could have found out the facts provided in the book for myself, but I've been in full employment until now and not had time to research the matter. That's the point of this book. Having a complete website is also very important, and Sustainable Population has that too, population.org.au. But there are some purposes and some publicity purposes for which a book has a special effect, and that's why Bill Lyons and I worked on it so hard and long. I think I'll use the rest of my time to take you through a few slides that are somewhat relevant to this issue.